What if the two nations that faced each other across the Pacific Ocean, nations that fought one of the most brutal wars in modern history, nations that built entirely different civilizations on opposite sides of the world, what if those two nations shared something in their blood that no one ever expected to find? What if the DNA of a Japanese farmer in Kyushu and the DNA of a Native American elder in Montana pointed back to the same ancestor living in the same frozen valley, tens of thousands of years before either Japan or America existed as concepts? And what if that connection did not end there? What if the genetic data from modern Japanese people and modern Americans of multiple ancestries revealed overlapping signals so unexpected that scientists had to run their calculations again just to make sure the machines were not making a mistake? This is not speculation. This is what the data shows, and the story behind it reaches back further than civilization, further than agriculture, further than any written record or oral tradition on Earth. It begins in a place that most people would never think to connect to either Japan or America. It begins in Siberia, and it ends with a conclusion that forces us to completely rethink what we mean when we say the words Japanese and American in the same breath. Stay with us, because what you are about to hear will permanently change the way you understand both of these nations and the ancient world that gave birth to them. To understand why this comparison matters, you first need to understand just how different Japan and the United States appear to be on every level that human beings typically use to measure difference. Japan is an island nation, geographically isolated, with a history of deliberate closure to the outside world that lasted for centuries. Its people developed one of the most distinctive cultural and genetic identities on the planet, shaped by thousands of years of relative isolation from the great migrations and invasions that periodically reshuffled the populations of mainland Asia. The United States, by contrast, is perhaps the most genetically diverse nation in human history, a country built almost entirely from waves of immigration spanning 5 centuries, drawing people from every continent, every ethnic background, every genetic lineage that exists in the modern world. On the surface, comparing the DNA of Japanese people with the DNA of Americans seems almost too broad to be meaningful. Americans are not a single genetic population. They are dozens of populations living under one political roof. And yet, when scientists began conducting large-scale genomic comparisons between Japanese populations and various American populations, they kept running into the same unexpected finding again and again. Beneath the obvious differences, beneath the recent history, beneath everything that separates these two nations in the modern world, there was a signal, old, faint, but unmistakably real. A genetic thread connecting the people of the Japanese archipelago to the people of the American continent in ways that no modern history could explain, because it was not modern history that created it. The first and most profound of these connections involves the indigenous peoples of the Americas. This is where the science becomes genuinely extraordinary. For decades, geneticists studying the peopling of the American continents have known that Native Americans, the original inhabitants of both North and South America, are descended from populations that migrated out of Northeast Asia. The precise timing and route of this migration has been debated extensively, but the general framework has been consistent. Sometime between 15,000 and 25,000 years ago, groups of ancient humans crossed from what is now the Russian Far East into what is now Alaska, either via a land bridge called Beringia that existed during the last ice age, or along a coastal route hugging the edges of the glaciers. These migrants were the ancestors of every indigenous American nation, from the Inuit of the Arctic to the Mapuche of Patagonia, from the Haudenosaunee of the Great Lakes to the Apache of the Sonoran Desert. And here is the critical connection. The ancestral population that crossed into the Americas, the people who became Native Americans, was not the same as the ancestral population that settled Japan, but they were neighbors. They shared a common origin in Northeast Asia, and crucially, the Jomon people, the original ancient inhabitants of the Japanese archipelago, whose DNA still flows in the veins of modern Japanese people, were closely related to the populations that eventually gave rise to the ancestors of Native Americans. When scientists compare the genomes of modern Japanese people with the genomes of various Native American populations, the signal of this shared ancient Northeast Asian ancestry is clear and reproducible. It shows up in haplogroup distributions. It shows up in principal component analysis. It shows up in admixture modeling. No matter which analytical tool you apply, the same picture emerges. The people of Japan and the indigenous peoples of America are genetic cousins, separated not by ocean, but by time. The ocean just made the separation look permanent. But the story does not stop with indigenous Americans, because the United States in the 21st century is not simply an indigenous nation. It is a nation whose genetic makeup reflects 5 centuries of forced and voluntary migration from across the globe. And some of the most unexpected findings in this comparison come from looking at what happens when you compare Japanese genomic data, not just with Native American populations, but with the full genetic spectrum of modern Americans. What scientists found was not just one unexpected connection, but several, layered on top of each other, each one telling a different chapter of the same deep human story. The second major connection involves something called the ancient North Eurasian lineage, a ghost population of prehistoric hunter-gatherers who lived across Siberia during the last ice age and whose genetic descendants contributed DNA to populations spreading in multiple directions. To the west, their descendants mixed with other populations and eventually contributed to the genetic makeup of Europeans, and later, through European immigration, to a large segment of modern white Americans. To the east, their descendants mixed with East Asian populations in ways that eventually shaped, among others, the ancestral groups that both crossed into the Americas and settled the Japanese islands. This means that the ancient North Eurasian genetic signal, a layer of ancestry tracing back to Ice Age Siberia, appears in traces in both modern Japanese genomes and in both Native American and European American genomes. It is a shared genetic inheritance from a time before any of these populations existed as distinct groups, a common ancestor who would have recognized neither the flag of Japan nor the flag of the United States, but who carries in his or her DNA the code that eventually built both nations. To understand the full scale of what scientists found, it helps to understand what a modern genomic comparison actually involves. Researchers do not simply take 2 genetic samples and measure whether they are similar or different in a binary way. They analyze millions of specific positions in the genome, called single nucleotide polymorphisms, or SNPs, and they use sophisticated statistical tools to tease apart which similarities are recent and which are ancient. They can distinguish between genetic similarity caused by recent mixing, like the genetic signal in Japanese Americans, who are literally descended from both populations, and genetic similarity caused by ancient shared ancestry that predates both populations by tens of thousands of years. When the studies in question filtered out the recent signal and focused specifically on the deep ancient ancestry, what they found was a layer of shared heritage that is genuinely prehistoric in origin. Not the product of trade, not the product of migration in the historical period, not the product of any human contact that anyone remembers. A connection forged in the Ice Age, preserved in the genome, and only now becoming legible to science. One of the most specific and striking pieces of evidence involves the Y chromosome haplogroup Q. This is a paternal lineage marker, passed from father to son across generations without recombination, that is found at extremely high frequencies among Native Americans. In some indigenous American populations, haplogroup Q accounts for nearly 90% of all male lineages. It is the dominant genetic signature of the original peopling of the Americas, and haplogroup Q did not originate in America. It originated in Northeast Asia, in the same ancient Siberian populations that were related to the ancestors of the Jomon people. The Jomon themselves carry haplogroup D, a different but equally ancient paternal lineage with roots in the same deep Northeast Asian ancestral pool. Haplogroups D and Q are sister lineages on the human Y chromosome phylogenetic tree. They share a common ancestor far more recently than either shares a common ancestor with European or African lineages. When you plot haplogroup D and haplogroup Q on the global genetic map, they appear as 2 branches of the same ancient Northeast Asian tree. One branch that stayed and became the Jomon, and one branch that walked across a land bridge and became the Native Americans. The implications of this for the modern concept of what Japanese and American mean are profound. Modern Americans of Native American descent carry the genetic legacy of people who were once the neighbors of the ancestors of the Jomon. And the Jomon, whose genetic contribution to the modern Japanese population has been estimated anywhere between 10 and 30%, with some studies suggesting even more in certain Japanese subpopulations, carry the echo of that ancient Northeast Asian world in every cell of their bodies. Every time a Japanese person and a Native American sit in the same room, they are, in the deepest possible sense of the word, family. Not close family, not family in any way that would show up on a standard genealogy test, but family in the way that only deep time and deep genetics can reveal. Now, it is important at this point to be precise about what the science does and does not show. No serious geneticist is claiming that modern Japanese people and modern Americans are genetically identical, or even particularly close in the way that closely related populations like Swedes and Norwegians are close. The genetic distances involved in this comparison are large. The similarities we are discussing are ancient, deep, and would not show up in the kind of consumer DNA test that tells you what percentage of your DNA came from Ireland or West Africa. What scientists are detecting is a signal that requires extremely sensitive analytical tools, very large sample sizes, and reference populations that include ancient DNA from extinct or near extinct lineages. The connection is real, but it is old. And understanding the difference between real and obvious is essential to interpreting what the research actually means. What makes these findings so scientifically significant is precisely that subtlety. The fact that a connection this ancient, 20,000 years old or more, is still detectable at all is a testament to how powerful modern genomics has become. A generation ago, this kind of analysis was simply not possible. Scientists did not have the computational power, the sample sizes, or the ancient DNA reference panels needed to see through tens of thousands of years of subsequent migration, mixture, and genetic drift. The ability to detect a signal this old and this faint is itself one of the great achievements of 21st century science. And the signal, once detected, tells a story that reshapes everything. That story goes something like this. Approximately 50,000 to 70,000 years ago, modern humans left Africa and began spreading across Eurasia. As they moved northward and eastward, they encountered increasingly harsh environments that forced them into smaller, more isolated groups. In northeastern Eurasia, in the vast territory that today includes Siberia, Mongolia, and the Russian Far East, a population developed that we now call the ancient Northeast Asians. From this population, multiple branches diverged. One branch moved southward and eventually gave rise to the main East Asian populations we know today, Chinese, Korean, and others. Another branch, the one that would prove to be the most consequential for both Japan and America, stayed in the north and split into two daughter groups. One of those daughter groups eventually made its way to the Japanese archipelago and became the Jomon. The other, mixing with additional populations along the way, including contributions from the ancient North Eurasian lineage of Siberia, eventually concentrated in the northeastern corner of Asia and crossed the land bridge into the Americas, becoming the ancestors of every indigenous American nation on Earth. Two paths, two oceans, two of the most dramatically different civilizations in human history, and both of them rooted at the deepest level in the same ancient people who once looked out at the same starless Arctic sky. The modern United States, of course, adds additional layers of complexity to this picture, because it is not only the indigenous American component of the American genome that shows unexpected connections to Japanese ancestry. There is also the matter of the East Asian American population, which numbers in the millions and includes a substantial Japanese American community, particularly on the West Coast. These individuals are direct carriers of Japanese genetic heritage in the American genomic landscape, and their presence in American population genetic studies creates a highly visible and expected similarity. But scientists are careful to separate this recent signal from the ancient one. They are not the same thing. They are not caused by the same historical events, and conflating them would be a serious methodological error. Beyond this, there are unexpected findings involving specific genetic variants, not ancestry in the broad sense, but individual gene variants related to metabolism, immune function, and disease susceptibility that appear at surprisingly similar frequencies in Japanese populations and in certain Native American populations, and that are largely absent or much rarer in European and African populations. These shared variants are not coincidences. They are the genetic fingerprints of the shared Northeast Asian ancestry, preserved across 20,000 years of separate evolution. Scientists studying the genetics of type 2 diabetes, for example, have noted that Japanese populations and certain indigenous American populations share specific risk variants that appear to have originated in the same ancient Northeast Asian ancestral population. The same is true for certain autoimmune conditions and metabolic pathways. The bodies of Japanese people and Native Americans are, in certain specific and medically significant ways, running on the same ancient software, inherited from the same long-lost population, expressed across two completely different civilizations on opposite sides of the planet. This is the conclusion that no one in the field of population genetics fully anticipated at the scale it was eventually discovered. The comparison between Japanese and American genomes was expected to yield two distinct, essentially unrelated profiles, the standard result of comparing populations separated by ocean and decades of geopolitical tension. What it yielded instead was a layered portrait of deep human connection, ancient shared ancestry, and the humbling realization that the Pacific Ocean, which has defined the geopolitical relationship between Japan and America for 2 centuries, is a very recent feature of their relationship. The genetic relationship between the ancestors of these two nations is older than the Pacific as a human barrier. It is older than agriculture. It is older than pottery, language, and organized religion. It dates to a time when the world was colder, smaller, and infinitely more connected than anything we have built since. And that is perhaps the most astonishing part of this entire story. Not just that the connection exists, but that it survived. That 20,000 years of separate history, separate languages, separate religions, separate wars, separate empires, separate everything, could not erase the molecular memory written into the DNA of both peoples by a group of hunters who crossed a frozen land bridge in the dark and changed the world without knowing it. The DNA of Japanese people and Americans has spoken. And what it says, quietly, precisely, in the language of base pairs and haplogroups and allele frequencies, is that the Pacific Ocean never fully divided us. That beneath every difference, beneath every conflict, beneath every assumption of absolute otherness, there is an older truth. A truth written not in history books, but in genomes. A truth that science is only now learning to read. We were connected before we were separated, and that connection is permanent, because it is not written in stone. It is written in us. But there is one more dimension to this story that deserves to be told in full, because it speaks directly to what these findings mean for the future of science and for the future of how two nations understand each other. For decades, Japan and the United States have been studied as a pair, economically, politically, militarily, culturally. Entire academic disciplines are devoted to the Japan-America relationship. And in all of that scholarship, all of that analysis, the genetic dimension has been almost entirely absent because it seemed irrelevant, because everyone assumed that the genetic story of these two nations was simple. Asian population on one side, diverse immigrant population on the other, with no meaningful ancient connection between them. The new genomic data overturns that assumption completely. It does not replace the political and cultural history. It does not make the Pacific War any less real, or the alliance any less complex, or the cultural differences any less meaningful. But it adds a layer beneath all of that history, a prehistoric foundation that changed the entire context. Scientists who have spent their careers studying the genomics of East Asian populations and the genomics of indigenous American populations are now in active conversation with each other in ways that were rare even 10 years ago. Ancient DNA from archaeological sites in Japan is being compared directly with ancient DNA from sites in Alaska and Montana and the Yucatan Peninsula. The data pipelines are flowing in both directions, and every new data set, every new ancient genome, every new SNP comparison adds more resolution to the same emerging picture, that the deep human history of the Pacific Rim is a single story, not two separate ones. That the ancestors of the Japanese and the ancestors of the first Americans were part of the same ancient world, moving through the same ancient landscape, carrying the same ancient genetic heritage in their bodies. There is a particular archaeological site in Alaska, a site that has yielded ancient human remains dating to more than 11,000 years ago, whose occupants' DNA, when fully analyzed, showed closer genetic affinity to populations in Northeast Asia, including the ancestral Jomon lineage, than to any other reference population on Earth. 11,000 years ago, before agriculture, before writing, before any of the civilizations we learn about in school. People in Alaska whose closest genetic relatives were the people who would eventually become the Japanese. That finding alone, one site, one skeleton, one genome, is enough to fundamentally reframe the question of what connects Japan and America. Not trade, not diplomacy, not the post-World War II alliance, something far older. Something written in the bones of a person who died 11 millennia ago on the edge of a continent that his or her distant cousins would never know existed. This is where science becomes something more than science. This is where the data stops being just data and starts being a story about who we are, all of us as a species, and where we came from. The Japanese and the Americans, in all their genetic diversity, in all their cultural difference, in all their complicated shared modern history, are ultimately the product of the same ancient human adventure. The adventure that began in Africa, moved across Eurasia, split at the edges of the world, crossed the frozen north into a new continent, and left its fingerprints in the genomes of two of the most powerful and distinctive nations on Earth. The results shocked the scientists. It may shock you too. But perhaps, when the initial surprise fades, what remains is something quieter and more important than shock. A recognition. A sense that the distance between Japan and America, measured in miles, in history, in culture, in politics, has always been smaller than it looked, and that the evidence for that smallness has been inside us all along, waiting in the double helix of every cell for someone with the tools and the courage to finally read it. Now we have those tools. Now we are reading it, and what it says changes everything.